There's a voice inside you that is very good at its job. You know the one. It arrives right at the moment when you were about to start. When you had opened the document, or laced your shoes, or finally cleared space on your desk. Right at that moment, the voice shows up. And it doesn't shout. That's what makes it so effective. It reasons with you. It's already late. You won't be at your best. You'd be better off starting fresh tomorrow, when you have more energy. Or you need to do a bit more research first, before you can begin properly. Or maybe it's quieter than that. Maybe it's just a feeling, a vague resistance, a pull toward the phone, a sudden interest in something else entirely. And before you've consciously decided anything, the moment is gone. The document is closed, the shoes are off, the desk is cluttered again, and you're doing something else, anything else, that doesn't feel like the thing you were supposed to be doing. An hour passes, sometimes a day, sometimes longer, and then it starts. That other feeling, the one that comes after. Not relief, not peace, something quieter and heavier than that. The specific low-grade shame of knowing you had a chance and didn't take it. Again. You've probably told yourself by now what this means. You've had the thought enough times that it has started to feel like a fact. I'm lazy. I have no discipline. Other people just seem to be able to do the work. Something is wrong with me. If you've lived inside that story, if that story has become part of how you understand yourself, then I want to ask you to stay with me today. Because that story isn't true. Not because you're doing fine and this isn't a problem. It is a problem. The pattern is real, and the cost of it is real. But the story about what the pattern means, about what it says about your character, that part is wrong. And getting it wrong is exactly what keeps the cycle going. Let me tell you what most of the advice about procrastination misses. Most of it treats procrastination as a time management problem, as if the issue is that you haven't found the right system, the right app, the right productivity method, as if the man who keeps putting things off just needs a better calendar. Some of it treats it as a motivation problem, as if the solution is to find your why, to visualize your future self, to get inspired enough that the resistance dissolves and the work becomes easy. And some of it, the harshest kind, treats it as a character problem, a failure of will, a sign that you're soft, undisciplined, not serious enough about what you claim to want. None of these get to the actual root, because procrastination is not primarily a time problem. It's not a motivation problem, and it's certainly not evidence that you're broken. Procrastination is an emotion problem. More specifically, it's what happens when a task triggers a feeling that your brain classifies as threatening, and your emotional mind, moving faster than your rational mind, decides to protect you from that threat by moving you away from the task. The task is not the obstacle. The feeling the task produces is. And until you understand what that feeling is and why it's there, no system in the world will fix it. Because the system doesn't address the emotion. It just tries to get you to override the emotion with willpower. And willpower, as most of us have learned, is not an infinite resource. Today, we're going to go underneath the procrastination. We're going to find what's actually driving it. And then we're going to offer you something more reliable than motivation or willpower. Something that actually holds. In 2014, a researcher named Dr. Fuchsia Saroy published work that reframed how psychologists understand procrastination. Her central finding was this: procrastination is not about managing time poorly. It is about managing emotion poorly. The person who procrastinates is not disorganized or lacking in intelligence. They are, in almost every case, responding to a feeling that the task produces. A feeling that is uncomfortable enough that the emotional brain decides quickly, automatically, below the level of conscious decision, that the best available option is to move away from it. The task itself might be completely manageable. The skill set might be sufficient. The time might be available. None of that matters, because the issue is not the task. The issue is what the task feels like in the moment of facing it. Think about a task you've been avoiding. Something specific. Not a vague aspiration. An actual task that you know you should do and haven't done. Notice what happens in your body when you bring it to mind right now. For most people, there's a subtle tightening, a mild aversion, something that is not traumatic enough to call fear, but is uncomfortable enough that the mind immediately starts looking for alternatives. That sensation is the thing. That is what procrastination is protecting you from. And the reason this matters enormously is that it completely changes the question you need to ask. Instead of, how do I make myself do this? The question becomes, what does this task make me feel, and why? That shift from force to curiosity is where everything begins to change. Because a feeling you can't name is a force you can't do anything about. It just runs. It moves you away from things without explanation, and you're left standing outside the closed door wondering why you couldn't walk through it. But a feeling you can name? That's something you can work with. Let me make this concrete, because the temptation is to nod along at the theory and never apply it to the actual thing you've been putting off. Here are the most common feelings that procrastination is protecting people from. See which one lands. Fear of failure. This is the most common. The task represents an attempt at something, and an attempt can be judged. It can come up short. It can confirm, or so the fear goes, that you're not as capable as you need to be. As long as you don't start, you haven't failed. The potential is still intact. The project that never began can still, in some imaginary version of itself, be everything you hoped it would be. Starting makes it real. And real things can disappoint. Think about the creative project that's been sitting in your head or in a half-open document for months. The business idea, the novel, the application. Why hasn't it moved? Almost certainly, somewhere underneath the "I'll get to it soon" is the knowledge that starting means finding out whether you actually have what it takes. And that's terrifying in a way that is very easy to dress up as being busy. Fear of judgment. The email that hasn't been sent. The conversation that hasn't happened. The work that hasn't been submitted. These tasks involve other people, and other people have opinions. They might respond in a way that stings. They might reject you, criticize you, find the work inadequate. This fear runs very deep in men, particularly around professional and creative output. There is an enormous amount of identity wrapped up in how others evaluate what you produce. And so the emotional brain offers a very neat solution. Don't produce it, and you can't be judged. The email stays in the drafts folder for 2 weeks. The message never gets sent. The report gets revised one more time before it's ready to share. And one more time after that. Fear
of not being enough. This one is harder to identify because it doesn't attach itself to a specific outcome. It's more like an ambient dread underneath the task. A man who believes, at some level, that he is fundamentally inadequate, that he doesn't quite have what it takes, that if he tries properly, he'll discover the gap between who he is and who he needs to be. That man will avoid the evidence. Not consciously. He's not sitting there thinking, I won't do this because I'm afraid to discover I'm not enough. It doesn't feel like that. It feels like not being in the mood. It feels like a low energy day. It feels like needing more time to prepare.
But underneath all of those reasonable sounding reasons is the fear that doing the thing will prove something he doesn't want to have proven. Now, go back to the task you thought of earlier. Which of these is operating? What is the specific feeling this task produces in you? Name it as precisely as you can. Not just, I feel bad about it. What specifically? Fear of failing? Fear of being seen and found lacking? The feeling that even your best might not be enough? The name matters. And we'll come back to why. Here's the trap that catches almost every man who struggles with procrastination. He concludes that the problem is his character. I'm lazy. I'm undisciplined. I'm not serious. Other people manage to do the work. Why can't I? And having concluded that, he tries to solve the problem through self-criticism, through contempt for his own weakness, through telling himself in increasingly harsh terms that he needs to sort himself out. This feels logical. It feels like the serious, honest thing to do, to look at the behavior, refuse to excuse it, and demand better of yourself. But it doesn't work. And there's a specific reason it doesn't work. Shame and self-contempt are not motivating forces. They feel like they should be. They feel urgent and serious, but psychologically, they do the opposite of what they promise. When you tell yourself you are lazy, you are reinforcing an identity, and people tend to act in accordance with their identity. The man who has genuinely come to believe he is lazy does not find it easier to act. He finds it harder because the story, I am lazy, functions like a prediction, and the brain, given a prediction, tends to look for evidence that confirms it. Every time you avoid the task, the story gets a little more confirmed. The shame deepens. And the deeper the shame, the more uncomfortable you feel in proximity to the task. Because the task now represents not just a piece of work, but the whole story of your inadequacy. This is what psychologists call a shame spiral. And it is one of the most effective traps a person can fall into, precisely because it looks like self-awareness. It feels like honest self-reckoning, but it is actually the avoidance mechanism wearing the mask of accountability.
True accountability does not look like contempt. It looks like clarity. Clarity says, I haven't done this thing. Here's what I think is actually going on. Here's what I'm going to do differently. Contempt says, I am a person who doesn't do things. I am lazy. I have always been this way. One of those moves you forward. The other keeps the loop running.
Marcus Aurelius was one of the most powerful men in the world. He was also a man who had to get up every morning. Not metaphorically, literally. He wrote in his private journal, the Meditations, about the specific experience of lying in bed in the early hours and not wanting to get up, about the warmth and comfort of staying where he was, about the internal voice that offered reasons to delay. Here is what he wrote to himself. At dawn, when you have trouble getting out of bed, tell yourself, I have to go to work. as a human being, not as an emperor, not as a philosopher, as a human being. What he was doing in that moment is not usually what people think of when they think of Stoicism. He wasn't suppressing the feeling of wanting to stay in bed. He wasn't pretending it didn't exist. He was offering himself a different frame, a different answer to the question, who are you? Not, do you feel like getting up? But who are you? And what does a person like that do? This is the fundamental Stoic shift on procrastination, and it is a profound one. The Stoics were not waiting to feel ready. They were not waiting for inspiration or motivation or the right conditions. They understood that virtue, including the virtue of doing what needs to be done, was not an attitude. It was a practice, something enacted daily through small choices. Not because you felt like it, because of what you had decided about yourself. This distinction between motivation and identity is perhaps the most useful thing you can take from this episode. Motivation is a feeling. Feelings are unstable. They rise and fall with sleep and hunger and weather and the news and 100 other variables you don't control. Waiting for motivation to do hard things is like waiting for the river to stop moving so you can cross it. The river doesn't stop. And if you're waiting for it, you don't cross. Identity is different. Identity is a decision, not a feeling, a conclusion you've reached about who you are and how people like you behave. The man who has decided he is someone who does the work doesn't ask himself whether he feels like it this morning. He asks a different question. This is who I am. What does that mean I do right now? That's not arrogance. That's not pretending to be someone you're not. It's the deliberate construction of a self, which is, in the Stoic tradition, the primary work of a man's life. Most advice about procrastination is secretly trying to solve a motivation problem. Get excited about your goals. Find your why. Visualize the future version of yourself. Build momentum. Get inspired. Some of that can be useful in the right moments. I'm not dismissing it entirely. But as a primary strategy for overcoming procrastination, it has a fundamental flaw. It assumes that action follows feeling, that you feel motivated first, and then you act. The research and the experience of most people who have built consistent habits suggests the opposite is closer to true. Action produces feeling. You don't wait until you want to go to the gym to go to the gym. You go to the gym, and then you find that you're glad you went. You don't wait until you feel like writing to write. You write, and then something opens up. You don't wait until the conversation feels easy to have it. You have it, and the dread you felt beforehand turns out to have been much larger than what was actually on the other side. The feeling follows the action, almost every time. Which means that the strategy of waiting until you feel ready is not just ineffective, it is backwards. It is asking for something that only the action itself can produce. There's a second problem with motivation as a target. Motivation is a finite resource. You can increase it temporarily through music, through reading something inspiring, through remembering why the work matters. But you cannot sustain it indefinitely. And the tasks that most need doing are rarely the ones that feel most exciting. The email you've been avoiding is not going to suddenly feel thrilling. The financial admin that's been building up is not going to become interesting. The difficult conversation you need to have is not going to start feeling comfortable. What you need is not a way to make these things feel better before you start them. What you need is a way to act regardless of how they feel.
That's what identity gives you. That's what the Stoics were pointing at. Not the feeling of readiness, the decision of who you are. Here are 3 things you can do, not as a system, but as a genuine shift in how you approach the tasks you've been avoiding. The first, name the feeling, not the task. The next time you notice yourself avoiding something, stop and ask one question before you do anything else. What does this task make me feel? Not what do I need to do? Not why haven't I done this yet? What does it make me feel? Be specific, not I feel bad about it. Fear of failure, fear of judgment, the sense that trying and falling short would confirm something you don't want confirmed. Name it as precisely as you can. Write it down if that helps. This act, the naming, does something physiological. Research in neuroscience shows that accurately naming an emotion reduces the brain's threat response. The thing that was driving the avoidance gets smaller the moment it becomes visible. You won't solve it by naming it, but you'll stop running from something you can't see. The second, reduce the emotional cost of starting. Here is what most people get wrong about procrastination. They try to solve the whole problem at once. They think, I'll sit down and work for 2 hours. And the emotional brain, which is doing threat assessment, remember, calculates the full weight of 2 hours of exposure to whatever feeling the task produces and declines. The answer is not to force that calculation. The answer is to make the calculation smaller. Not work for 2 hours. Work for 5 minutes. Not write the whole report. Write 1 paragraph. Not have the whole difficult conversation. Send 1 honest sentence. The goal is to get across the threshold, because the threshold is where the resistance lives. Once you are inside the task, once you are actually doing it, not preparing to do it, the emotional resistance almost always drops. The thing becomes manageable. Sometimes it even becomes interesting. Marcus Aurelius didn't solve getting up every morning by making it feel easy. He solved it by getting up. The feeling adjusted to the action. Your job is not to feel ready. Your job is to start. And starting is always smaller than you've been making it. The third, build the identity before you need it. This is the longer game, the one that changes things permanently rather than just for today. Spend some time, seriously, not aspirationally, deciding who you are, not who you want to be, not who you will be when you fix this, who you are. I am someone who does what I said I would do. I am someone who starts even when it's uncomfortable. I am someone who shows up for the work, because that is what showing up for my life looks like. These statements are not affirmations in the self-help sense. They are identity declarations. And the reason they matter is that when a decision point arrives, when the voice shows up and starts reasoning with you, you don't have to rely on motivation to override it. You just ask, who am I? And what does someone like that do right now? That question, answered honestly, is more powerful than any productivity system. Because systems are external. Identity is internal. And the man who has settled the question of who he is does not need to negotiate with the voice every single morning. He already knows what he's going to do. Come back to where we started. The voice, the reasonable delay, the moment when the task was right there and something inside you moved away from it. I want you to see that moment differently now. Not as evidence of a character flaw, not as proof that you're the kind of person who doesn't follow through,
as information. The avoidance was telling you something. It was telling you that this task is triggering a feeling that you haven't yet learned to sit with. That somewhere beneath the procrastination is a fear that hasn't been named, a vulnerability that hasn't been acknowledged, a question about yourself that you've been trying to avoid answering. That's not laziness. That's a very human response to something that feels threatening. And the man who understands that, who can look at his own avoidance with curiosity instead of contempt, is already doing something the man in the shame spiral cannot do. He's seeing clearly. And from clarity, movement is possible. Not comfortable movement. Procrastination rarely dissolves into ease, but honest, deliberate, identity-driven movement. The kind Marcus Aurelius practiced in the cold of a Roman morning. The kind that doesn't ask how you feel. The kind that asks who you are. You are not lazy. You are a man who has been avoiding a feeling. Name the feeling. Reduce the cost of starting. Start. Not because you're ready. Not because you feel like it. Because of who you have decided to be. Here's the one thing worth carrying with you. Procrastination is not a character flaw. It is an emotional response to a feeling you haven't yet named. Find the feeling. Name it precisely. And then take the smallest possible step toward the thing. Not because the feeling goes away, but because you have decided that your identity is more important than your comfort. That's the practice. Not once. Daily. Imperfectly. With the understanding that every time you start, despite the resistance, you are quietly building the man who starts. Not the man who waits to feel ready. The man who goes. Marcus Aurelius got up. Not every morning with ease, but every morning. That's the whole lesson. I'll see you in the next one.